The first thing I noticed wasn't the sound. It was the vibration. A low, steady rumble that shook the coffee cup on my nightstand and rattled the picture frames of my grandfather in his ranch hat. I thought it was thunder at first, one of those sudden Texas storms that rolls in from the plains without warning. But the sky outside my bedroom window was clear, the kind of sharp blue that makes you believe the day is going to be good. Then the roar hit. Deep, mechanical, angry. I was halfway down the stairs before I even registered that I was barefoot, still wearing yesterday's jeans. When I flung open the front door, the August heat slapped me in the face, along with the sight that would burn itself into my memory forever. A bulldozer, yellow paint smeared with dust, was crawling across my pasture like a metal predator. Its blade, low, heavy, and unapologetic, shoved through the oak fence my great-great-grandfather had planted himself in 1875. The posts were hand-cut, weathered silver with age, each one a history book in wood grain. That fence wasn't just a line in the dirt. It was the handshake between generations. And in seconds, it was splintered on the ground like it had never mattered. The operator sat inside the cab, sunglasses on, one hand casually resting on the throttle. To him, this was just another work order. To me, it was watching the blood in my veins being drained out into the dirt. I started running. Gravel cut into my feet, but I didn't feel it. I was fueled by something hotter than pain. Hey, my voice cracked under the strain. Kill that engine. The guy didn't even glance down. Instead, he angled the blade toward another section, scooping up wood and barbed wire in a single mechanical shrug. That's when I saw her. A white pickup truck sat parked on the shoulder of the dirt road, spotless and polished like it had never known mud. Leaning against the door was a woman in a black suit. Out here, where a clean pair of jeans is formal wear. She had a clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, and her smile. Her smile looked like it had been practiced in a mirror until it could cut glass. She saw me coming and didn't move. Not an inch. You should be thanking us. I took a step closer, and she didn't back up, but she didn't need to. The clipboard in her hand was her weapon, and she knew it. With a snap, she flipped it open and held out a stack of documents with neat county seals and official stamps. All filed, all approved. The sun was so bright I had to squint, but I could still make out my family's ranch name printed at the top, right above a signature that was supposed to be my grandfather's. My grandfather, who'd been dead for 40 years. I didn't say anything. My mind was still trying to reconcile the impossibility of what I was looking at with the reality of a bulldozer tearing through my pasture. Jillian tilted her head, reading me like she'd seen this scene play out a dozen times before. I understand this is difficult, but it's already in motion. You can't stop it. That last part, that casual certainty, hit harder than any insult. I yanked my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. While the call connected, I turned and started dragging fallen fence boards back into place, stacking them in the bulldozer's path. My hand shook, but I kept moving. The dispatcher picked up, and I gave my address, my voice clipped and urgent. They're destroying my property. Send deputies now. When the sheriff's truck pulled up 15 minutes later, I thought for sure Jillian and her crew were finished. But instead of stepping in front of the bulldozer, the deputy took the papers from Jillian's hands, scanned them, and handed them back. Looks in order, he said. I stared at him. You can't be serious. My family's owned this land since before Texas was even a state. The deputy shrugged like his hands were tied. If it's filed with the county, it's legal. You can challenge it in court, but I can't stop them. The bulldozer's engine roared back to life. Jillian smiled, slow and deliberate. Like I said, mister. Hayes, you can't stop it. The fence gave way with a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. By sundown, there was a fresh stripe of dirt carved through my pasture, wide enough for 2 trucks to pass side by side. The old oak posts lay in a pile like firewood, stripped of their history. And in my mailbox, wrapped in an official-looking envelope, was the next blow. HOA versus Cameron Hayes. Damages, $25,000. The letter claimed I had obstructed a public easement and threatened essential infrastructure. They wanted court costs, daily fines, and a permanent injunction to stop me from ever rebuilding my fence. The ink wasn't even dry before I knew one thing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a hit. That night, I sat on the porch with my grandfather's old Winchester resting across my knees. The crickets were loud. The stars were bright. But the hum of machinery and the flash of that white pickup's chrome wouldn't leave my head. And somewhere beyond my fence line, what was left of it, Jillian Harper was probably celebrating. This wasn't going to be a property dispute. It was going to be a war. The lawsuit papers sat on my kitchen table like a snake coiled and waiting. I'd read them 3 times since sundown, and each time the words bit deeper. Damages, $25,000. Permanent injonction. Daily fines, $500. It was a language designed to intimidate. Every paragraph dripping with the cold certainty of people who knew they could crush you without ever raising their voices. The next morning, I walked the length of the new dirt road cutting across my pasture. The earth was raw and jagged where the blade had torn through it, still littered with splinters of oak posts. I stopped at one that still had a chunk of barbed wire clinging to it, the wire my grandfather had stretched with his own hands. That fence had been more than just wood and metal. It was the first thing my father taught me to repair. It was where my grandfather leaned in the evenings, sipping coffee while the cattle grazed in the distance. And now it was gone, replaced by a scar in the land that felt like a scar in me. But the thing that kept needling my mind wasn't the destruction. It was the signature. My grandfather's name, written in that easement like he'd signed it yesterday. He'd been gone for decades. My gut told me that paper was poison, and if I didn't get it tested, Jillian would bury me in it. I started making calls. Most lawyers either didn't deal with property disputes or clammed up the second I mentioned HOA. The few that stayed on the line made it clear they'd need a retainer big enough to choke a bull. It was my neighbor Rick who finally gave me a name. "You need to talk to William Davis," he said over the phone. 50 years old, mean as a snake when it comes to property law. HOA tried to take his workshop once. They regret it to this day. William's office sat above a feed store in town, a cramped space that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old leather. Law books were stacked in leaning towers against every wall. The man himself looked like he'd been carved out of stubbornness, square jaw, salt and pepper hair, and eyes that missed nothing. I laid the easement on his desk. He didn't read the first page. He went straight to the signature. His brow furrowed. "When did your grandfather pass?" he asked. 82. William leaned back in his chair, lips pressing into a thin line. "This says March 85. Either your grandfather rose from the grave to sign this, or someone's committed forgery." The words hit me like a shot of cold water. I'd suspected it, but hearing it from someone who knew the law, that changed everything. William pulled out a folder thick with old case notes. "I've seen this before," he said. "HOA's working with developers. They find a piece of land they want, dig through county records, and when the owner's dead, especially if the family isn't watching, they slide in a fake easement. Most folks never notice until the bulldozers arrive. And the cops just side with them?" I asked. "They side with paperwork," Williams said flatly. "And right now, they've got more of it than you do." That afternoon, William took the easement to a contact in the county clerk's office, someone he trusted, and came back with a detail that made my stomach churn. "The notary seal looks perfect, too perfect, and the notary listed? Retired in 1980. He didn't smile when he said it, but I could see the glint in his eyes. We found our first crack in Jillian's wall. Over the next week, the harassment began. Every morning, a fresh violation notice arrived in my mailbox. $500 a day for obstruction, meaning the broken fence boards I'd propped back up to keep my cattle from wandering onto the new road. Neighbors I'd known for years stopped waving when they passed on the highway. At the diner, conversations went quiet when I walked in. I didn't have a guess why. Jillian was hosting community meetings, spinning me as the selfish rancher standing in the way of public safety. Rick told me she'd even suggested, in that sweet, poison voice of hers, that I'd rather see a child die waiting for an ambulance than let the road stay open. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been working. One night, I sat on the porch, sorting through boxes of my grandfather's papers. Tax returns, handwritten notes about cattle feed, maps with faded pencil lines marking property boundaries, and at the very bottom of one box, a will. His original will. The paper was yellowed, but intact, written in his blocky handwriting. And there, in the middle, was a clause that made my pulse kick. This land shall never be subject to easement without unanimous consent of all living heirs, renewed every 10 years. Not only had my grandfather anticipated this kind of attack, he'd shut the door on it entirely, if anyone in the family actually enforced the will. And here's the thing, the will had never gone through probate, which meant it was still legally binding. When I showed William the next morning, he let out a low whistle. This, he said, tapping the paper with one calloused finger, is the kind of thing that can blow their case wide open. If the easement wasn't legal to grant in the first place, the whole road is illegal. For the first time since the bulldozer, I felt something like hope. But hope is a dangerous thing in a fight like this. 2 nights later, William's office was broken into. They didn't take anything, not computers, not cash. They just scattered our case files across the floor, left the front door unlocked, and spray-painted over his security camera. Professional. Intentional. A message. When I saw the mess, a cold certainty settled in my gut. Jillian, or whoever was backing her, knew we were getting too close. William didn't scare easily, but even he started locking his office twice and checking over his shoulder. He brought in a forensic handwriting expert, Dr. Sarah Kim, to analyze the signature on the easement. She worked in silence for nearly an hour, comparing it to old ranch deeds and letters from my grandfather. "This is a trace," she finally said, "done by someone with skill. They lifted his signature from an authentic document and overlaid it here. The pressure patterns are identical. No natural handwriting is that perfect. It was proof, not suspicion, not gut feeling. Proof. But proof doesn't stop a bulldozer once it's moving." And Jillian wasn't slowing down. The HOA filed an emergency motion claiming my resistance endangered essential infrastructure. They wanted the court to order me to remove all barriers, physical or legal, or face immediate seizure of the property. "They're going for the jugular," Williams said grimly, scanning the filing. "They're trying to force this through before we can get the fraud evidence into the record." I sat back in my chair, staring at the papers. I'd never been sued before, never been threatened with losing everything. And now, I was up against people who played the system like it was a deck of cards they'd stacked themselves. But I kept thinking about my grandfather's voice on those long walks at dusk. "This land chooses its people, son, but it'll only fight for the ones who fight for it." Well, I was ready to fight. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor polish and stale coffee, like a place that had seen more desperation than justice. I'd been in the building plenty of times before, paying taxes, renewing tags, but walking through those double doors with Jillian Harper waiting inside was something else entirely. She was already seated at the far end of the hallway, clipboard in hand, a fresh suit as black as a crow's wing. When she saw me, she smiled, not polite, not warm, but with the slow curl of someone enjoying the view from a higher ground. William leaned in and murmured, "Don't look at her. Make her come to you." We were here for the first hearing on the HOA's emergency motion. If they won, the court could order immediate removal of anything standing in the way of their road, up to and including my right to even contest the easement. It was a fast track to losing before we'd even presented the fraud evidence. Inside the courtroom, their lawyer, a slick Dallas man named Marcus Sterling, painted me as a reckless obstructionist putting lives at risk. He spoke of ambulance delays, fire hazards, and public safety emergencies with the confidence of a man who'd never seen an ambulance on a dirt road in his life. I sat there, jaw tight, while William dismantled their claims point by point. 2 other access roads already existed. Emergency response times were faster without cutting through my ranch. But still, the judge didn't rule. She said she'd take it under advisement, which sounded too much like leaving a loaded gun on the table. Back outside, the sun was brutal. Jillian intercepted me before I reached my truck. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Cameron," she said, stepping just close enough that I could smell her perfume. $100,000. Cash. And I'll limit road usage to emergencies only. This all goes away tonight." I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in the way she said it. Smooth, reasonable, as if she wasn't standing knee-deep in a swamp of lies. "Not for sale," I said. Her smile didn't fade, but her voice dropped to a whisper that slid under my skin. "You have no idea who you're messing with. We've buried bigger problems than you." She walked away before I could answer, her white pickup gleaming in the sunlight like a challenge. That night, I found a figure standing just beyond the edge of the barn light. Too far to make out a face, but close enough to know I was being watched. When I stepped toward them, they melted into the tree line without a sound. By morning, 2 of my cattle were missing. The old gate on the west fence, the one facing the new dirt road, was standing wide open. I didn't call the sheriff. I already knew how that would go. 3 days later, William called with a lead. "You need to meet someone," he said. "A whistleblower. County office." But he's spooked. "Wants it quiet." We drove 15 miles out to an abandoned gas station, the kind of place where the windows are covered in plywood and the pumps are long gone. A battered pickup with no plates was parked out front. Inside, a man in a baseball cap sat in the shadows. "They'll fire me if they know I talked to you," he said without introduction. "Or worse." William gestured for him to go on. The man slid a manila envelope across the dusty counter. Inside were photocopies of closed-door county commissioner transcripts, stamped confidential. My eyes caught a name that made my stomach turn: Jake Morrison. The transcripts showed Morrison, our county commissioner, fast-tracking easement approvals for Lanier development without public hearings. Not once, not twice, dozens of times over 3 years. Every one tied to property acquisitions at 20% below market value. "They're working in tandem," the whistleblower said. "Developers find the land. HOA handles the pressure. Commissioner pushes the paperwork through. And by the time anyone notices, it's done." I asked the question hanging in the air. "And my ranch, your property, is the keystone. Without that road, there's subdivisions dead in the water. They stand to lose millions." The man left before we could ask anything else. The next day, William and I started digging into county records. What we found made my blood run cold. For other families had posthumous easements on file, each one signed by an owner years after their death. One of them was Elena Rodriguez, 72, living on the same land her parents had bought in the 1940s. We drove out to see her. Her house was small but tidy, the garden behind it just starting to sprout green after winter. Over coffee in chipped mugs, she told us her story. "They said it was for the children," she said, voice shaking. "A playground, a safe place. I signed. Now my garden is gone. Bulldozed. When I try to plant again, they find me." The worst part wasn't her words. It was the way she wouldn't meet my eyes, like she was ashamed for believing them. When we left, William's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "They pick the ones who can't fight back," he said. "Elderly. Alone. Just enough land to matter." That was when the fight stopped being about me. I thought about my grandfather's will, about the oak posts that used to stand straight in the summer sun. I thought about Elena's ruined garden and the families in those transcripts. Jillian wasn't just trying to steal a road. She was running a machine, one that chewed up land, history, and people without a second thought. I'd been defending my ranch. Now, I was going to burn that machine to the ground. We moved fast. William filed motions to subpoena Morrison's financial records and the HOA's banking history. At the same time, he called in a reporter he trusted from Dallas, someone who didn't mind getting under the skin of local politics. The article hit the front page 2 days later. Forgery allegations rock county land deals. The reaction was instant. HOA board members called emergency meetings. Morrison gave a tight-lipped interview claiming the allegations were politically motivated. Jillian went on local TV, looking straight into the camera and calling me a dangerous obstructionist who was willing to gamble with public safety. It might have worked until the reporter published copies of the forged easements, including my grandfather's, alongside the death certificates proving the owners couldn't have signed them. By that evening, the phone in my kitchen rang. Not William. Not Rick. Cameron Hayes. The voice was female, low, and urgent. "I know what they're planning next. Meet me tomorrow morning. You won't get another chance." She hung up before I could ask her name. Something in my gut told me this was the pivot, the point where the road either bent toward survival or went straight off a cliff. And for the first time since the bulldozer came, I felt the old ranch fighting with me. The woman from the phone call was waiting at the diner before sunrise. She wore a faded denim jacket and kept her hands wrapped tight around a coffee cup like she was holding on for warmth, though the air inside was already stuffy. "Name's Lisa," she said quietly. "Used to work for Lanier Development. Not anymore." William sat beside me, notepad ready. "What changed?" "They stopped hiding it," she said. "At first, I thought we were just doing tough deals, pushing landowners to sell for community improvements. But when I saw the easement for your ranch, I knew it was the same game they played in 4 other counties. Forged documents, bribed commissioners, HOA fronts to keep the heat off the developers." I asked the question that had been chewing at me for weeks. "Why my land?" Her eyes met mine steady. "Because without that road, they can't connect the subdivision to the county highway. You're the cork in a $50 million bottle, and they'll smash the bottle to get it open." She slid a flash drive across the table. Financial records, emails between Jillian and Morrison, copies of contracts showing payments to a notary who's been dead 10 years. William looked at it like it was a live grenade. "This is enough to bury them." Lisa shook her head. "Not yet, because they know it's coming, and they'll hit you before you can hit them." By the time we left the diner, my pulse was a drum in my ears. The sky was just turning pink over the feed store when we stepped outside, and that's when I saw it. Spray painted in red across the hood of my truck. "Sell or bleed." William swore under his breath. "They're done playing nice." The next week was a siege. 2 more of my cattle went missing. A pile of broken glass was dumped across my driveway. At night, I heard engines idling out on the dirt road, lights off. By morning, violation notices from the HOA were back in the mailbox, each one bolder than the last. Inside, the walls of the ranch house felt closer every day. I barely slept, pacing the porch with my grandfather's old Winchester balanced across my arms. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the awareness of being hunted, that primal instinct that tells you every shadow could hold a threat. We met with the reporter again in William's office. He'd gone through Lisa's files and confirmed every lead. "It's airtight," he said, "but it's not enough to stop them unless we get it into open court. If we drop it now, they'll crush you before the trial." William nodded. "We need to force discovery, and the only way to do that is to hit them first with a countersuit for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. That'll paint a target on my back the size of Dallas," I said. William leaned forward, voice steady. "It's already there, Cameron. The only question is whether you're going to stand still and let them aim." The day we filed the countersuit, Jillian showed up at my ranch again. She didn't bring the fake smile this time, just a private security guard built like a doorframe. "You're making a mistake," she said, standing in my driveway like she owned it. "We could have ended this quietly. Now you've forced my hand. I didn't move from the porch. You forged my grandfather's signature. You stole land from my neighbors. You've buried people under legal fees until they lost everything. And you think I'm the one making a mistake." Her eyes narrowed. "You won't survive this fight." Then she turned and walked back to her truck. The guard stayed behind for a second longer, his hand resting on something under his jacket. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. 2 nights later, William's office was hit again. This time they took computers, every scrap of digital evidence we'd compiled. But William had expected it. The real files were already backed up in 3 different places, including one outside the county. "They're scared," he said, holding up the untouched flash drive Lisa had given us. "Which means we've got them." Court moved fast after that. Our countersuit triggered subpoenas for bank records, and the first batch landed like a sledgehammer. $280,000 in consulting fees paid directly to Jillian from Lanier Development. Wire transfers from shell companies tied to Morrison's wife. Payments to the notary, the one who'd been dead since 2010. But the HOA didn't slow down. They filed for an emergency injunction, claiming the road was already critical infrastructure and that my resistance was a clear and present danger to the public. It was a manufactured crisis, complete with fake traffic studies and affidavits from supposed EMTs. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I walked the property line under a sky full of stars, stopping where the old oak fence used to stand. I could still see my grandfather there, leaning against a post, coffee in hand, telling me stories about men who'd tried to take this land and failed. This land chooses its people, son, but it'll only fight for the ones who fight for it first. For the first time, I felt the weight of what he'd meant. This wasn't just about my ranch anymore. It was about every acre, every garden, every family they'd stolen from. And in the morning, I was going to carry that into court like a weapon. The courthouse was packed the next day. Reporters, neighbors, even Elena in her Sunday dress. Jillian was there too, surrounded by her lawyers, flipping through papers with that same shark smile. Sterling opened with his usual performance. My client's road provides essential emergency access. Mr. Hayes's obstruction puts lives at risk. The public good must come before personal sentiment. When it was our turn, William didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just laid out the facts, the forged signatures, the payments, the whistleblower's transcripts, one piece at a time like a craftsman building a gallows. Then he handed the flash drive to the clerk. Exhibit 14, he said. Financial records showing direct payments from Lanier Development to HOA President Jillian Harper in exchange for the fraudulent easement on Mr. Hayes's property. The courtroom went still. Jillian's face didn't move, but her hand tightened on her pen until her knuckles whitened. When the judge called for recess, William leaned over. We're not done. Tomorrow, we call her to the stand. I sat back in my chair, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down. The evidence was there. The witnesses were ready. But there was still the gnawing truth. Powerful people don't go down easy. If Jillian knew she was cornered, I had no doubt she'd try something desperate. And when that happened, I'd have to be ready, not just to win, but to survive it. The second day of the hearing felt different the moment I walked into the courtroom. The air was heavier, like everyone knew something was about to break. Reporters had packed the benches, their cameras trained on the defense table where Jillian sat, pen tapping rhythmically against her legal pad. William leaned toward me. This is it. We're putting her under oath. When Jillian took the stand, she looked almost relaxed. Perfect posture, hands folded neatly in her lap. Sterling stood beside her, every inch the polished defender. Ms. Harper, he began, can you confirm that all your actions as HOA president were in the interest of community safety? Absolutely, she said, voice warm. I serve without compensation, purely for the good of our residents. Her delivery was flawless. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed her myself. Then it was William's turn. He rose slowly, letting the silence stretch. Ms. Harper, he said, you testified just now that you received no compensation for your work. Is that correct? That's correct, she replied without hesitation. William picked up a folder from our table and walked it to the evidence stand. Exhibit 14. Bank records showing wire transfers totaling $280,000 from Lanier Development to your personal account over the past 3 years. Can you explain these? Jillian's jaw tightened, but her smile didn't fully break. Consulting fees. Unrelated to my HOA duties. William's tone stayed calm. Unrelated? Then why do those payments correspond exactly with dates that fraudulent easements were filed, including the one from Mr. Hayes's ranch? She hesitated for the first time. The reporter's pens scratched faster. I can't speak to the timing, she said. William stepped closer, his voice dropping. What about this one? He held up a photocopy of the forged easement, dated March 1985, signed by Mr. Hayes's grandfather, 3 years after his death, and notarized by a man who'd been retired for 5 years. Jillian shifted in her seat. I wasn't involved in document preparation. That was the responsibility of our legal committee. William didn't take his eyes off her. Then why did we find your initials on the margin of the draft copy? The room was dead quiet. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Sterling objected, claiming the initials could have been added by anyone, but the judge overruled him. William nodded to the bailiff, who plugged the flash drive into the courtroom projector. The first image appeared, an email from Jillian to Commissioner Morrison, discussing finalizing the Hayes easement and ensuring the notary seal matches previous cases. Gasps rippled through the room. William's voice was like steel. You weren't just aware, Ms. Harper. You orchestrated it. You had a financial interest in the development, and you used your position to push through fraudulent documents. Isn't that true? I refuse to answer on the grounds, she began. On the grounds that you'll incriminate yourself? William cut in. The judge's gavel struck once. Answer the question, Ms. Harper. For the first time, her mask slipped. I was following orders, she snapped. You think I wanted to deal with this? Morrison was the one pulling the strings. I did what I had to do to protect myself. That was the opening William had been waiting for. Protect yourself from what, Ms. Harper? She looked at him, then at the judge, and for a moment I thought she might actually tell the truth. But instead, she crossed her arms. No further comment. William turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to call our next witness, Lisa Warren, former employee of Lanier Development. Lisa stepped forward, steady despite the weight of every eye in the room. She confirmed the emails, the payment schedules, the coordination between Jillian, Morrison, and Lanier's executives. And then she dropped the match. Lanier Development's entire subdivision project depended on that road through the Hayes property, she said. Without it, the county wouldn't approve the build. Jillian was paid to get that easement by any means necessary, including forging signatures. Sterling tried to claw back control, objecting to hearsay, attacking Lisa's credibility. But William had one last card to play. He walked to the evidence table, picked up a small box, and opened it. Inside was the original will we'd found in my grandfather's papers. This document, William said, legally prohibits any easement without unanimous consent of all living heirs, renewed every 10 years. This will was never processed through probate, which means it's still enforceable. The easement Jillian Harper relied on was not only forged, it was legally impossible to grant. The judge studied the will for a long moment before looking up. Ms. Harper, do you dispute the authenticity of this will? Her voice was barely a whisper. No, and that was it. The moment the whole war turned. The judge's ruling came down like a hammer. The easement was void. The road through my pasture was illegal. The HOA's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. And Jillian's testimony, combined with the financial records and Lisa's evidence, was referred immediately to federal prosecutors. But Jillian didn't go quietly. As the bailiff escorted her from the stand, she leaned just close enough for me to hear. You think you've won, Hayes? This isn't over. Outside the courthouse, the crowd surged around us, reporters shouting questions, neighbors clapping me on the back. Elena hugged me so tight I felt her ribs. William kept his voice low. Enjoy this moment. But keep your guard up. People like her, they don't take defeat well. He was right. Even as the relief washed over me, I knew this wasn't the end of the fight. Not until every piece of this machine was dismantled. But for the first time since the bulldozer tore through my fence, I felt like the land was breathing again. The federal arrests happened faster than anyone expected. 2 days after the judge's ruling, black SUVs rolled up to the HOA office and to the county commissioner's brick ranch house on the hill. Morrison was led away in handcuffs, his face as red as the soil beneath our boots. Jillian left the courthouse flanked by agents, her expensive heels clattering on the steps like the last echoes of a rain that was over. The news hit every local station. Fraud, forgery, racketeering. By week's end, Lanier Development had gone dark, its website replaced with a single line, operation suspended pending investigation. But for me, the victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the silence that settled over the ranch that first night without engines idling at the fence line. It was in the way the wind carried only the sound of crickets, not bulldozers. The court ordered the road removed and the land restored to its original condition. Watching their hired crews dismantle what they'd built was like seeing a river run backward. They hauled away the gravel, tore up the compacted dirt, and replanted native grass seed under the guidance of a local restoration team. Then came the fence. I thought about replacing it with something modern, steel posts, wire mesh, but when the restoration crew asked, I knew there was only one answer. We rebuilt it the old way. Hand-cut oak posts, spaced by eye, the way my grandfather had taught me. The smell of the fresh wood mixed with the dust in the air, and every time a post went into the earth, it felt like planting a promise. It took 3 months, and when we were done, the pasture line looked exactly like it did in the photographs hanging in my hallway, straight, proud, and immovable. I could have stopped there, put the fight behind me, and gone back to ranch work. But every time I drove into town, I passed Elena's garden, still bare, the soil compacted from the heavy equipment that had rolled over it years ago. So I took some of the punitive damages from the judgment and hired a team to restore her land, too. Not just the garden, but new irrigation lines, fresh topsoil, and a white picket fence to keep the deer out. The day we planted the first row of tomatoes, she stood beside me with tears tracking down her cheeks. "My grandchildren will eat from this again," she said. Word spread. Other families who'd been targeted came forward. Some had already lost their land. Others were still fighting. That's when William suggested something that hadn't crossed my mind: a legal defense fund for rural property owners. We launched it in the old Grange Hall on Main Street. The turnout surprised me. Ranchers, farmers, small business owners. People who'd never spoken publicly about the intimidation they'd faced. We set up a team of volunteer lawyers, funded entirely by donations and the money from my settlement. "No one fights alone," I told the crowd. "Not here. Not anymore." Months passed. The seasons turned. The grass grew tall again along the rebuilt fence line. I'd walk it every evening, boots kicking up the scent of sage and dust, and sometimes I'd swear I could hear my grandfather's voice in the wind. "You did good, boy." The trials wrapped up quietly compared to the storm that started them. Morrison took a plea deal, 2 years in federal prison and a lifetime ban from holding public office. Jillian wasn't so lucky. The paper called her the architect of the scheme, and the judge sentenced her to 4 years plus restitution to every family she targeted. They auctioned her house 6 months later. I won the bid using the very money she'd been ordered to pay me. Then I donated it to the county's Veterans Housing Program. Watching the first family move in was the purest satisfaction I'd felt in a long time. A stolen property turned into a home that could never be touched by greed again. One evening in late autumn, Elena invited me to her garden's first harvest since the restoration. The smell of roasting peppers and fresh bread filled the air. Her grandchildren ran between the rows, their hands stained green from husking corn. "This," she told me, handing me a plate loaded with food, "is what justice tastes like." We ate under strings of lights, neighbors laughing and talking the way they used to before fear seeped into every corner of the county. I realized then that the fight had given us more than our land back. It had given us our community back. But the land was where the truest victory lived. On the first cold morning of winter, I walked the pasture before sunrise. Frost clung to the rebuilt fence, each barb of wire shining silver in the pale light. The oaks stood dark and solid against the horizon, the same way they had in my grandfather's time, the same way they would long after I was gone. I stopped at the oldest post, the one we'd left in place, even though the wood was soft and worn. My grandfather had sunk it into the earth himself, his initials still faintly carved into the grain. I ran my fingers over them, the cold biting my skin. "This land chooses its people," he used to say, and now I knew what he meant. Before I headed back, I saw a hawk circling high above the pasture. For a moment, the light caught its wings just right, and it looked like it was floating on gold. I stood there watching until it vanished into the clouds, carrying with it the last of the fight's weight. I'd rebuild my fence, restore my land, help my neighbors reclaim what was theirs. And I'd done it without selling an inch of the ground my family had bled for. The developers could count their losses. The HOA could lick its wounds. The county could shuffle its papers and pretend it hadn't been part of the rot. But the land? The land remembered who it belonged to. And as long as Hayes' blood runs, it will never forget. Some things can be bought. Some can be stolen. But this land, this history, isn't one of them. It's older than the men who would take it, stronger than the laws they bend. And if they come again, they'll find me here, standing at this fence, ready to fight as long as it takes.